Today we have three stories about people who each have this one big thing in their lives that brings them an immense amount of happiness, fulfillment, and purpose, but unfortunately, this very same thing winds up being the exact reason that their lives get completely ruined. One afternoon in June of 1993, a famous movie director named Shed Jin sat on a plush couch inside a warm production studio in the city of Yinchuan, China. He was sitting next to a few key members of his production team, and they were in the absolute middle of auditioning what felt like the 100th terrible actor for the lead role in the upcoming feature film that he was directing. However, this was not an ordinary lead role by any stretch of the imagination. The lead role for this specific film was not going to be played by a human being at all. The lead role was actually going to be played by a dog. The movie was called An Old Man and His Dog, and it was based on an incredibly popular novel about a lonely elderly man living during a period of intense war in China, whose only companion was his fiercely loyal yellow dog. People all over the country had responded deeply to the story in the book because it captured, with incredible honesty, just how devastating war could really be on small rural communities, and a lot of families in China had seen their own struggles reflected in the characters on those pages. At this point in the pre-production phase, Shed Jin had already successfully cast all of the film's human actors, but the dog's role was proving to be by far the hardest one to fill, and it was obviously the most central element to the entire movie. He and his casting team had hosted a bunch of open casting calls already, and had even placed large advertisements in public newspapers, asking if anybody had a dog that matched the physical description of the one in the book. Tons of hopeful dog owners had answered this advertisement, but none of the dogs they brought into the studio were even close to being good enough for the film. The reason for that was simple. Shed Jin knew that while the dog certainly needed to look the part, it actually needed to be much more than that. The dog had to be incredibly compelling, expressive, and charismatic despite being an animal. This dog was the true hero of the narrative and the emotional soul of the entire movie, so it had to project absolute loyalty, bravery, and pure goodness on screen. It had to come across as gentle and sweet enough that the audience would instantly fall in love with it. But the casting calls were an absolute nightmare. Some of the dogs that were brought in were far too small and could not be easily seen on camera next to the tall human actors. Other dogs were incredibly loud and would not stop barking at the crew members, which made it impossible to record any clean audio in the studio. Some of the animals were completely terrified of the giant studio lights and the heavy black cameras, causing them to whimper and hide behind their owner's legs. As Shed Jin watched yet another anxious, poorly trained dog scurry chaotically around the studio floor, he felt a massive wave of anxiety washing over him. He was starting to feel deeply worried that maybe the perfect dog actor just did not exist in real life, and if that was the case, then his movie was going to be an absolute disaster. He would be forced to cast a bad actor in the lead role, and the film would completely flop upon its release. For Shed Jin, a failure like that represented an absolute worst-case scenario. Decades earlier, back in the 1950s, Shed Jin had been a prolific and highly celebrated director in China, winning many prestigious national awards. However, during China's Cultural Revolution, which was a period of massive political and social unrest in the country during the 1960s and 1970s, Shed Jin had been harshly ostracized by the public and the government because of his unpopular political views. Ever since those difficult years, he had been struggling constantly to regain his status as a respected filmmaker. So, the chance to adapt this brilliant, touching, and tragic novel, which was already beloved by millions of people, was his ultimate opportunity to prove his talent once again and get back on top of the industry. He knew that because of his advanced age, if this movie failed, he would very likely never get another chance like this, and his legacy would be completely forgotten. As the current dog's audition finally came to a disappointing end, Shed Jin sat back on the couch, feeling incredibly hopeless. His producer walked up, gently took the leash of the anxious dog, and led the animal and its frustrated owner out of the room. Shed Jin was so caught up in his own worries that he barely even noticed when his producer walked back in, guiding the next dog and its owner through the door. But when Shed Jin finally looked up and saw the animal standing right in front of him, which was the 101st audition of the day, his breath caught in his throat, and he practically gasped out loud. Sitting right in the center of the audition room was a dog that looked exactly like the one he had pictured in his mind while reading the book. It was a shaggy, large, yellow-haired dog with an incredibly eager-to-please expression in its dark eyes, and Shed Jin felt an instant, powerful connection to the animal. The owner who had brought the dog in was a friendly, polite young man in his early 30s who introduced himself as Chung. Chung explained to the director that he had only recently started up his own professional dog training and breeding company. Having his personal dog cast as the lead in a major motion picture would be a massive breakthrough for his brand new company, and it would easily put his name on the map. This meant the stakes were incredibly high for both of them. Shed Jin was initially a bit hesitant when he heard that Chung had only just started his training business, because it suggested that the young man might be relatively inexperienced. However, as soon as the formal audition began, any doubts the director had completely vanished. Throughout the entire demonstration, Chung skillfully and calmly directed his dog as if he had been doing this kind of high-level work his entire life. The dog was clearly highly intelligent, executing every single complex command with flawless precision. It would sit, stay, roll over, and fetch on command, but it did so with a level of focus that was truly rare. But more than that, as Shedjin watched the audition unfold, he realized that this dog did not just look the part, it actually acted the part. The animal possessed a rare, natural screen presence that you simply could not teach. It was the absolute perfect fit. After only a few minutes, Shedjin raised his hand, stopped the audition, and told Chung that he and his dog had officially got the job. They began filming the movie just a few days later, and almost immediately, all of Shedjin's lingering anxieties disappeared. Just as he had anticipated, the dog was an absolute natural on set. It obeyed Chung's subtle hand signals without a single moment of hesitation, and the camera absolutely loved the animal's expressive face. The dog had this incredibly sweet, tender quality that shone through whenever the main actor playing the old man interacted with it on camera. In one particularly emotional scene, the old man had to lie in bed pretending to be ill, and the dog was supposed to walk over and gently rest its head on his chest. During the very first take, the dog walked over, looked directly into the actor's eyes with an expression of pure, unscripted sorrow, and gently placed its chin on his chest, staying perfectly still until the director called cut. Shedjin knew right then and there that this dog was going to steal the hearts of audiences all over the world. He poured all of his creative energy, focus, and passion into every single frame of the production. By the time they finally wrapped filming a few months later, Shedjin was absolutely certain they had created a masterpiece, and he was entirely correct. When the film was officially released, it was met with rave reviews from critics and audiences alike. An Old Man and His Dog was not only recognized as one of the very best films of the year in China, but it was also widely celebrated as an instant classic internationally. Shedjin had achieved exactly what he set out to do, and his career was completely revitalized. He was once again celebrated as a visionary director, and he felt a profound sense of peace. Fast forward a year and a half later, to a quiet evening in late January of 1995. Shedjin was sitting comfortably in his living room in Shanghai, reading through a new screenplay. Because of the movie's massive success, he was once again in incredibly high demand, and his telephone rang constantly with producers begging him to look at their projects. When the phone rang on this particular evening, Shedjin picked it up, assuming it was just another producer wanting to pitch a script. However, when he answered, it was indeed one of his main producers, but the tone of their voice was incredibly serious, and what they said next completely stunned him. His masterpiece, An Old Man and His Dog, was being officially banned by the Chinese government. Shedjin sat there in absolute silence, completely unable to process what he was hearing. It made absolutely no sense to him. Why would a wholesome, family-friendly movie about a loyal dog and an old man be banned? It contained zero political messaging, and it had been beloved by the public for over 18 months. In China, films were occasionally banned if the government felt the content was politically sensitive, or if someone involved in the film's production became embroiled in a massive public scandal. But Shedjin had been on his best behavior, and the rest of the cast and crew were highly respected professionals. Shedjin asked his producer what could have possibly happened to warrant such an extreme reaction. The producer took a deep breath and told him that the ban had absolutely nothing to do with Shedjin, the actors, or the story itself. The problem was the dog. Just a few days earlier, the police had arrested the dog's friendly owner, Chung. It turned out that Chung was not just an aspiring dog trainer. He was actually a prolific serial killer who had spent the last 5 years brutally murdering at least 5 different people. The local community was in complete shock, as Chung had always seemed like a polite, hard-working young man who was simply trying to build a successful business. But the horror did not stop there. The main reason the government had taken the drastic step of banning the film was because of how Chung had chosen to dispose of his victims' remains. After murdering and dismembering them in his home, Chung would take the body parts and feed them directly to his yellow dog. This was the exact same dog that had spent months on set, licking the faces of the actors and being celebrated as a symbol of pure, innocent love. The government realized that from that moment on, nobody would ever be able to watch this heartwarming film without realizing that the heroic dog on screen was actually sustained on human flesh. Shedjin was devastated. He went on to direct a few more films, but his momentum was completely gone and his career ultimately stalled. He never achieved that level of success again, and his legacy would forever be tied to the horrific actions of a serial killer and his flesh-eating dog. One chilly evening in December of 1966, an 8-year-old girl named Elaine Ellery was practically skipping down the street as she tried to keep up with her parents. They were walking towards the entrance of a massive manufacturing factory in the town of Norfolk, England. Elaine was filled with an overwhelming sense of excitement because tonight was the night of her father's annual workplace Christmas party. For her entire childhood, Elaine had listened to her father talk about this factory, but because she was so young, she had never actually been allowed to step inside the building. Tonight was her very first time, and she could hardly contain her joy. Elaine shared an incredibly close bond with her father. Even though his job required him to work extremely long and grueling hours, he always made a conscious effort to make Elaine feel like she was the most important person in his world. During the long work week, her dad would actually walk all the way back home during his brief lunch break just so he could give Elaine a big, warm hug and sit down to eat a quick meal with her before rushing back to the factory floor. He worked with raw materials, moving heavy bags of powdered minerals, completely unaware of the invisible dust filling the air around him. These daily lunches were the highlight of Elaine's childhood, and she loved listening to his stories about the giant machines and the bustling environment inside the facility. When they finally reached the heavy doors of the factory and walked inside on the night of the party, Elaine was absolutely mesmerized. The interior of the building was enormous, and it had been completely transformed into a winter wonderland. The air was filled with the lively sound of holiday music, the cheerful chatter of hundreds of employees and their families, and the delicious aroma of warm apple cider and freshly baked pastries. The entire entry hall was draped in glittering tinsel and festive lights, and the concrete floor was covered in a thick layer of fluffy, white fake snow that made the whole place look like a magical holiday village. Elaine spent the entire evening holding her father's hand, meeting his friendly co-workers, and running around the giant machines. The fake snow was everywhere, and children were throwing handfuls of it into the air, laughing as the white powder drifted down like real snow, coating their hair and clothes. By the time they got back into the car to drive home, Elaine was completely exhausted but incredibly happy, drifting off to sleep with a heart full of joyful memories. As Elaine grew up, her childhood remained incredibly happy and stable. She and her father stayed just as close as they had always been, attending the factory's Christmas party every single year and continuing their beloved tradition of sharing lunch breaks together. Her father's incredible work ethic and his unwavering dedication to his family deeply shaped the person Elaine became. She learned from his example that no matter how hard life got or how busy you were, your family always came first. When Elaine reached her early 20s, she got married and eventually had 2 beautiful children of her own, and she made a promise to herself that she would raise them with the exact same love and dedication that her father had shown her. But in 1983, when Elaine was just 25 years old, her world came crashing down when her father suddenly passed away. The loss was absolutely earth-shattering for her. Her father had been her anchor, her role model, and her best friend, and she could not imagine a world without him in it. He had suffered from a rapid decline, struggling to breathe and losing his strength in his final months. However, as the intense initial wave of grief began to slowly pass, Elaine found comfort in the realization that her father's spirit was still very much alive within her. By raising her own children with the same values of love, hard work, and family priority, she was keeping his memory alive every single day. Fast forward 41 years later to a warm afternoon in the late summer of 2024. Elaine, who was now in her late 60s and happily retired, was sitting quietly at her kitchen table in her Norfolk home, reading the daily newspaper. Elaine's retirement had been peaceful, and she spent most of her time visiting her children, playing with her grandchildren, and simply enjoying a slower pace of life. However, over the past few weeks, Elaine had been experiencing an unusual and persistent feeling of absolute exhaustion. At first, she tried to shrug it off, thinking that perhaps she was just getting older, but the deep fatigue refused to go away. On this particular afternoon, as she sat perfectly still at the table, she suddenly found herself struggling to catch her breath. It felt as though she had just run a marathon, even though she had not moved from her chair. A sudden wave of panic washed over her as she realized she could not get enough air into her lungs. She decided to stand up and walk over to the kitchen sink to get a glass of cold water, hoping it would help her calm down. But as she took her first few steps, her vision began to blur and she had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter just to keep herself from collapsing to the floor. Realizing that this was a serious medical emergency, Elaine managed to hobble back to the telephone and call her doctor. Within the hour, one of her children arrived at the house, helped her into the car, and rushed her to the local hospital. After a series of extensive diagnostic tests, including x-rays and a painful procedure to drain fluid from around her lungs, the doctors finally came back with an explanation for her severe symptoms. But the diagnosis they delivered was not just devastating, it also cast a dark, horrifying shadow over Elaine's most cherished childhood memories. The doctors revealed that Elaine was suffering from mesothelioma, an extremely aggressive and terminal form of cancer that targets the lining of the lungs. This specific type of cancer is almost exclusively caused by the inhalation of microscopic asbestos fibers, and it often takes 40 to 50 years after the initial exposure for the disease to actually develop. It was the exact same rare cancer that had taken her father's life back in 1983. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a heartbreaking truth was revealed. Back in the 1960s, the factory where her father worked had used massive amounts of asbestos in its manufacturing processes. Her father had been exposed to the toxic dust every single day on the factory floor. But because the health risks of asbestos were not widely understood at the time, no safety precautions were taken and workers would go home covered in a fine white powder. When her loving father would walk home during his lunch break to give Elaine a big hug, his work overalls were completely covered in microscopic asbestos fibers. Every time he held his daughter close, he was unknowingly transferring the deadly dust directly onto her clothes and into her lungs. Even worse, the magical fake snow that Elaine had played in during those wonderful factory Christmas parties was not fake snow at all. It was actually raw industrial asbestos waste that the factory owners had spread across the floor to create a festive atmosphere for the children. The very things that had made Elaine feel so loved and cherished by her father, his daily lunch break hugs and the magical holiday parties, were the exact things that had poisoned her. Elaine spent her remaining months surrounded by her family, reflecting on the tragic legacy of her life before she ultimately passed away from the disease in 2025. It was a cruel reminder that sometimes the gestures of love we hold closest to our hearts can carry the most devastating consequences, completely changing how we view our past. Around 9 o'clock on the evening of January 18, 2015, a 68-year-old retired man named Dennis Antiporuk stood at his kitchen counter in North Miami Beach, Florida, carefully writing a brief handwritten note. The note was addressed to his wife and his adult daughter, Laura, who both lived with him in their comfortable condominium home. Dennis was a creature of habit, and his note was simply letting his family know that he was stepping out for a little while, but that they should not worry because he would be back home in just a couple of hours. It was very common for Dennis to head out late in the evening. He was an outgoing, friendly man who loved to socialize, and he had a tight-knit group of retired friends who met up almost every single night at a local Denny's diner restaurant just down the street. Dennis had spent his life working hard to provide for his family, and now that he was retired, he fully embraced the warm Florida weather and the relaxed style of North Miami Beach. The diner was open 24 hours a day, and it served as the perfect gathering spot for the group to sit in a booth, drink endless cups of coffee, and talk about everything from local news to family updates. Tonight was supposed to be just like any other night, but Dennis had decided to make one quick stop before heading over to the diner. He made sure to write this detail down in his notes so his family would know exactly where he was. After leaving the note on the kitchen counter where it could easily be seen, Dennis grabbed his keys, his wallet, and his cell phone and walked out the front door of the apartment. A few hours later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Laura was pacing anxiously back and forth across the living room floor, clutching her cell phone in her hand. She and her mother had returned to the condominium around 10 o'clock that night and had immediately seen Dennis's note on the counter. At the time, they had smiled, knowing he was just out enjoying himself with his friends, but now, several hours had passed and Dennis was long overdue. Laura had tried calling his cell phone multiple times, but the calls would not even go through to a ringing tone. Instead, the line went dead silent for a second before transferring her directly to his automated voicemail. With her worry growing by the minute, Laura decided to call the Denny's diner directly. She knew the staff there very well, and she figured they could easily look over at his usual booth and tell her if he was still there. But when the employee answered and Laura asked if her dad was in the restaurant, the worker told her that Dennis had never showed up at all that evening. A cold dread began to settle in Laura's chest. If her dad had never made it to the diner, then where could he possibly be? She walked back over to the kitchen counter and picked up the handwritten note once again, desperate for any kind of clue. As she stared at his handwriting, she focused on the first part of his itinerary. Dennis had written that before he went to Denny's, he was going to head upstairs to the building's amenities floor to relax for a little while. The condominium complex featured several high-end common areas on the top floor, including a fully equipped gymnasium, a beautiful indoor swimming pool, and a private relaxation suite that Dennis absolutely loved to use. Laura realized that her dad must have gotten distracted or fell asleep upstairs. She immediately ran out of the apartment, got into the elevator, and rode it up to the top floor. When she stepped out, the entire floor was quiet and dimly lit with a cold draft blowing through the empty corridors. She walked over to the gymnasium first, pushing the door open to find a pitch-black empty room. She then walked over to the pool area, peering through the glass security doors, but the water was completely calm and there was nobody in sight. That left only one other place. Across the hall from the pool was a heavy, insulated wooden door that led to the building's private sauna room. Dennis frequently used the sauna to help soothe his aching muscles, and he had mentioned in his note that he wanted to get a quick session in before meeting his friends. Laura walked over to the door and reached out to turn the heavy metal handle. She found that the door was completely unlocked, and she slowly pushed it open. But the moment the door cracked open, Laura was instantly hit by an incredibly intense, suffocating wave of heat and a horrific, sickening smell that immediately made her lungs burn. The odor was so foul and overwhelming that she had to cover her mouth and step back into the hallway, coughing violently as her mind raced to understand what was happening. Fighting through the panic and the terrible smell, she stepped back up to the doorway and looked inside the wooden room. There, lying completely motionless on the upper wooden bench, was her father. When the emergency personnel arrived on the scene a short time later, they made a shocking and tragic discovery. Earlier that evening, Dennis had entered the sauna and closed the heavy insulated door behind him. To activate the heating system, he had turned a mechanical timer on the wall, which was designed to run the heater for a set amount of time before automatically shutting it off as a safety precaution. Dennis had then laid down on the wooden bench to relax, but the soothing heat quickly caused him to fall into a very deep sleep. While he was asleep, a catastrophic mechanical malfunction occurred within the sauna's timer control panel. Instead of slowly ticking down to 0 and cutting the power, the timer mechanism became physically stuck in the on position. The heavy-duty heating elements continued to run at full power, constantly pumping extreme dry heat into the small airtight wooden room. The temperature inside the sauna rapidly soared past normal levels, climbing higher and higher into a lethal range. Because Dennis was in such a deep sleep, his body was unable to wake him up as his internal temperature reached critical, life-threatening limits. The extreme dry heat put an immense and unbearable amount of strain on his cardiovascular system. Eventually, the extreme heat caused Dennis to suffer a fatal cardiac arrest. Because the switch remained fused in the on position, the temperature kept rising, leaving him inside the intense heat for hours until his daughter arrived. When forensic investigators later examined the electrical control box, they discovered that the internal gears of the mechanical timer had completely melted into a solid lump of plastic, which had permanently locked the circuit in the active state. The sudden loss left his beloved family completely broken, struggling to understand how a routine relaxation session could end in such an incredibly horrific manner. An investigation into the condominium's safety procedures revealed a long history of skipped maintenance inspections on the common amenities, which eventually led to a massive civil lawsuit and a statewide push for mandatory safety shutoff valves in all residential saunas. For Dennis's friends at the local Denny's diner, their nightly evenings would never be the same, and they kept his favorite corner table empty for many weeks to honor him. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!